Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Masterclass. I'm your host, PokéNav, and each episode I bring you experts from across the Pokemon card world to take your knowledge of the TCG to the next level. My guest today is one of the premier competitive Pokemon card players in the world and an all around true English gentleman. Please, everyone, welcome the one and only OmniPoke. What is going on, Joe?
Thanks for having me on, man. That was a really nice introduction. So cheers.
Oh yeah, it's great to have you here. Obviously, we are in a big disparity in time zones right now, so making this work was awesome, and I'm really excited for our conversation today because of all the three big aspects of Pokemon, at least the aspects, in my opinion, of collecting, investing, and competitive play. This is really the area that I am most unfamiliar with. So I'm really
hmm
expecting
hmm
to learn a lot today. And I'm also interested to see how the competitive scene, how that coincides with the collecting and investment realm, and see if there's, possibly some crossover there as well. So really looking forward to gain insight from you. So, like I said, let's go ahead and start off. Let's start off with the competitive arena. And I know a lot of people out there, this is probably the area that they're most unfamiliar with as well. So, if you wouldn't mind just starting off by giving us a little bit of background on yourself for people who may not be familiar with you. And then, how did you get started in the competitive side of Pokemon?
Yeah. So I've started playing. Well, I got back into Pokemon in around 2009. This is the Diamond and Pearl era. Legends Awakened was the latest set out at the time. And I was just cracking some packs essentially. And I only really stumbled upon competitive play because I opened a pack, got an Uxie Level X, which was a pretty much the best card competitively at the time. And because I just was unfamiliar with level X's altogether, I just searched what Uxie level X was essentially. And that just took me down the rabbit hole of the competitive scene. There was article sites and all that sort of stuff. So that's really how I got involved in a Pokemon scene way back then, after
Mhm.
previously just opening packs for nostalgia sake kind of thing. So that's really how I got into it. In terms of what was your question? The how do you get involved with the TCG?
Yeah, yeah. How did you really, because I'm sure you probably had familiarity with kind of collecting Pokemon and the
Sure.
TCG overall.
Yeah.
So what made you make that crossover and really get knee deep into the competitive realm?
Yeah, so it was really just experimentation. I was just curious about the TCG because I'd never played it when I was younger. I think that's the story for most of us, that we just
Hmm.
collected them only ever. And it was just grassroots stuff, really. I went to a couple leagues, started to learn the rules, started to make some friends that way. And then it eventually evolved into going to tournaments and more tournaments. And I'm a competitive person by nature, so I like that aspect of competing against other people. There's also a ton of creative elements to the trading card game because every 3 months we get a handful of new cards, which does usually change up the format quite a lot, and they do a good job of rotating old sets as well. So there's normally a good amount of like freshness to the trading card game, and it's evolved massively since I've started playing. And since its inception, it's changed radically. So it's always keeping you on your toes and sort of reacting to the new cards that are coming out, which is also like a fun challenge I find a lot of the time.
Hmm. Yeah, and just like yourself, it's actually interesting that I never got more into the competitive scene because I myself, I'm also very competitive. I was an athlete for most of
Yeah.
my life, and it is strange that there isn't more of a focus, and maybe this is just my naivety. And ignorance kind of in the larger realm of Pokemon, but it seems like there isn't as much emphasis placed upon the competitive scene. It seems like most people, when they're getting into Pokemon, uh, the deepest that I ever got into it, from a strategical standpoint, was kind of the playground rules. When I was a
Right.
kid, it's like I got a Charizard, he's got a flamethrower for 100 damage, it knocks out everything.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I think the early card game was actually, the base set and the first few sets, the game was very, very young, and really it was just the effects on the cards were pretty wild and made it difficult to actually play the game in the first place. So it's
Hmm.
not surprising that it wasn't intuitive to kids when we were younger, but they've done a lot of things to make it more beginner friendly, I think, to at least get the entry base knowledge at this point. But yeah, base set wasn't really, even though it was targeted to kids and very basic, still just kind of too complicated to just teach someone who's like 5, 6, 7 years old. They just don't have the attention span really a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's different now, but back then, yeah, we just saw the pictures and said, I have more hit points.
Yeah,
Basically.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, if you were, explaining to someone like me who's really a novice when it comes to, competitive play, would you be able to give us maybe like a high level overview of kind of exactly how the game operates? Again, just kind of from like a kind of a meta approach. You don't have to get into the details or anything.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously the rules of the game is trying to just knock out your opponent's stuff before they knock out yours. Both people have 6 prize cards at the beginning of the game, and the first person to take those 6 prize cards is the most conventional way to win the game of Pokemon. And you're
Hmm.
normally trying to use energy cards to power up attacks and launch attacks at each other. But there's a ton of sort of maneuvering within that. Of course, it's not just the ground level, but in terms of the meta game, there's things like weakness that come into effect. Obviously, sort of a crossover from the video game is where, lightning types are weak to fighting types. Well, in the game, it would be ground and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's because the typing isn't the same in VGC as it is in TCG. But there's a
Hmm.
very similar thing where you can have resistances, weaknesses, and obviously the attributes on the cards are all different. Some of them are just functional to help you draw cards or get set up in the game. Some of them are your sort of main attackers that you're trying to use against people. And the metagame essentially evolves around the most powerful, the most consistent, the most easily chainable attackers. Chainable meaning that you can use it turn after turn after turn kind of thing. Because it's not good enough just to power up one attacker to see you through the entire game. That will very rarely ever work. So it's trying to
Hmm.
set up multiple over the course of, at the moment, it's an average of maybe 5 to 7 turn kind of games, from start to finish kind of thing. So that's really where the game's evolved to right now. In current standard format, the most playable cards are those Tag Team GX cards from the Sun and Moon block, and then the V and V Max cards are also some of the most powerful cards, just because the amount of raw hit points that they have. They're hard to knock out. They deal the most kind of damage. So most decks are circulating around those sorts of cards, really.
Interesting, interesting. Well, and it kind of makes sense because and I'm already starting to see some crossover here between what is very applicable in the competitive realm to what cards are popular among collectors and investors as well. So I'm kind of already seeing that as well. Um, so how has, if we look back at the older days, the WotC days, and compared to now, how has the game changed, and how has the strategies for players like yourself, how has that changed along the way?
Yeah, so obviously the card pool originated quite small, so there was only a very small pool of decks that were viable. As new sets came out, that would change things up. I think one of the biggest changes, obviously, back in 99, 2000, just the share of information was so difficult and so different to today. Whereas today, whenever there's a tournament that happens, you pretty much instantly get information like given to you either through other YouTube content or just through like article websites and all these other things that can track results. Whereas back then, it was just kind of trial and error, and you were only coming up against who was in your local area, sort of thing.
Hmm.
And there were like blogs and stuff, but it was all much more niche and narrow for those who are at the very top tier. I think really the story of the beginning, going forward is always power creep. It's the same with every trading card game. Hit points get higher, attacks get harder, that sort of thing. And that continues throughout the entire TCG. There's a rotation every year. So the oldest number of sets kind of get blocked out. So they're no longer usable for the new standard format. There is also an expanded format, which gives you a larger card pool, which is black and white on. But typically the standard format is, that's the format that everyone plays at Worlds and the international championships, the 4 largest tournaments in the year outside of Worlds. So standard is the main format that we all play, and that cycles basically every year where they just chuck out the oldest stuff. For example, at the moment, we're team up on, and every Sun and Moon set pre-team up is no longer usable for standard format play.
Mm.
And we would assume that if there is a rotation this August, it would be Sword and Shield meta on, so the tag team sets would rotate. That's the expectation. But yeah, I mean, progressing through the years, there's been a ton of different strategies. A lot of successful decks work around trying to ramp up attacks fast, just by getting extra energies into play, tons of rain dance style effects to do that. Mostly basic attacking Pokemon are the best, just the way that Pokemon decks are constructed, because you need to, for stage 1 and 2 decks, you don't only need to commit spaces to your deck to the basics, but also to the evolution cards. And these
Hmm.
cards don't draw you cards or manipulate your opponent's board or your sort of hand, anything like that. So just playing basic Pokemon allows you to typically play more item and trainer cards, which means that you draw better throughout the entire game. And it
Hmm.
means that you only need to find one Pokemon to be in play to start attacking. Whereas if you're playing evolution style Pokemon, you have to wait a turn for them to evolve, and they start out weak and they get stronger, that sort of thing, which is
Hmm.
kind of what we all associate with Pokemon. But when it comes down to the trading card game, it's very, very different, where almost, there's been times in Pokemon where evolutions have been the strongest decks, like the start of the GX era, where the Pokemon were far, far stronger if you had to evolve into them. But that eventually, once again, became a basic format, just because the way you draw cards in Pokemon really tends more towards committing less space to the Pokemon and more towards trainer cards, which allow you to manipulate the deck much better.
Interesting, interesting. There was a lot of really good pieces of information that you gave in there, and again, I'm starting to kind of see some themes between what we see, especially in the investment realm of prices, and when we start to see those start to creep up, and we'll definitely get to that. But
Mhm.
if somebody is, and I want to get into the card mechanics as well, because I'm interested to hear how some of the new mechanics, like what we're going to see with single strike and rapid strike,
Mhm.
how that might influence deck building and things like that as well. But first of all, if somebody is just wanting to start out and get into the competitive arena and kind of take their game to the next level, you've got a lot of experience,
Mhm.
not only in like regional tournaments but world tournaments as well. What is the process of potentially getting onto the world stage?
Yeah, so Worlds is actually the only like invite only tournament. You can go to literally every other tournament out there each year. Worlds is normally in August time, and you need to accumulate points throughout the entire season to eventually hit a threshold that gets you to the World Championships. But there are basically just different size scale tournaments going on that offer different sort of championship points. That's the structure that you
Hmm.
earn throughout going to tournaments. So the lowest grassroots level would be league challenges, typically around like 30 or so players possibly, and you get a small number of points. But those are probably seen as like the least competitive, the easiest entry point for you if you were a newer player. Similarly, league cups, again, probably sub 100 player tournaments most of the time, and they give out a handy amount of championship points. You can there's a cutoff for league cup and league challenges throughout the season of points you can earn from these sorts of events. So essentially, that means that if better players or more experienced players, they go to, for example, 8 league cups and they win 8 league cups, they then have no incentive to go to league cups again that season. So
Hmm.
essentially, it means that there will eventually be a point where there's, some of the best players have no incentive to go to those events, but they will go to other ones. So it should leave space for other players to still achieve points quite effectively, I would say. And then the step up from that is special and regional events. Regional events can sometimes be, I would say between 400 and up to possibly 1,000 in popular regions within the US. That's where there's the largest player base.
Hmm.
Japan is completely opposite from the rest of world rankings, actually. So Japan has their entire own ladder, and they basically don't play with us unless it's the World Championships. That's the only time we get to play with Japanese players, unless they want to come to international championships. Even though they could earn championship points, it wouldn't do anything for them. They're just going for the experience. So for the
Wow,
most part, we
interesting.
only, yeah, I find that really, it's a shame really, but it's because they get sets released before we do. So they basically
Hmm.
always play like 3 months ahead of us a lot of the time
Mm.
in terms of the cards that have been released. But yeah, these regional and special events, regionals can have pretty good pricing. I think it's $5,000 for the winner of a regional championships. And it scales downwards. And on top of that, you can get product as well as you go. I think it's like the top 64 or top 128 will get a certain number of booster packs, and it, you know, scales upwards the better you do in tournaments. You oftentimes get like play mats and stuff like that, and promotional cards just for attending these events. And that will be a high standard of play, I would say. So if you definitely just want to gain some experience, I would say League Cups and League Challenges are the safest bet. But if there is a regional like near you within a couple hours, why not show up and, you know, try your luck and just gain that experience is what it's all about, really. You know, you can get a lot of experience just playing online on the PTCGO clients. Whenever you open a booster pack, you get a booster code. You can use those codes to play PTCGO. A lot of people just chuck those codes away, but you can use them if you want to start learning the TCG. And the only step up from regionals and special events is then international championships, which there are 4 in the year. There's one in Europe, one in North America, one in Oceania, and one in Latin America. And these are very large scale events, and these give out the most points essentially. And players sort of just before the international championships, there's a little cutoff where a certain number of points earned can earn you a travel award to some of these locations. So if you've been doing well in regionals, well in League Cups, you could be on a threshold to get a free trip to Brazil, a free trip to you know, Australia, those sorts of things. So these international championships are high profile. They want the highest profile players there. They're always streamed by Pokemon. The official commentary team always turn up there. And yeah, that really just brings a lot to the table, I think. And they are some of, you know, for people who can't achieve a Worlds invite, they are the biggest tournament of the year for that region, essentially, which is very cool. And then it really just all ends up at the World Championships, which is typically a 2-day event where a lot of people will earn a day 1 entry, and then only really the top like 16 or so players will have an automatic entry to the day 2 of the event. So only extremely good and consistent players make it to that day 2 of competition. But of course, competing in day 1 can also get you into that day 2 as well, that final sort of pool of competition. Then you go all the way up to the finals on that day 2, and then the Sunday is just the finalists of the juniors, the seniors, and the masters division. Those categories are just based on age, and I think masters division is 16 and up, if I recall correctly. I can't remember for juniors. I think it's like 12 and below, something like that. And the seniors sort of is wedged in the middle there. But the masters division is actually by far the most popular age bracket compared to the others. So yeah, that's a quick rundown really of how a tournament calendar looks for the trading card players.
Really cool, really cool. And you know, to me, like when you're talking about this, I'm thinking to myself, you know, unless you know, in other sports or even esports, you know, a lot of these people are sponsored. You said, you know, there is the possibility that, you know, if you are playing really well, you might be able to get, you know, an expenses paid trip to some of these areas like Brazil. But it does seem like, you know, if depending on how far you want to take it, expenses can add up quickly with a lot of traveling in there. So, and I know that you have found other ways of getting to, you know, going to tournaments, you know, commentating and things like that. But you know, what have you done to really be able to finance a lot of your tournament play?
Ironically, it's one of the reasons why I started my YouTube channel, was essentially to fund my travel for the year.
Good idea.
So it basically, that's one of my main ways to do it. Obviously, you do recoup an amount of money by attending these tournaments if you're competent enough and able to have good runs in certain events. So I think since 2016, Pokemon has done a really good job of changing the pricing structure and has made it a lot more viable for someone like me to spend a weekend going to like France and to Spain and to Italy and these sorts of areas because of the amount that you can recoup in events, which I think is a really good thing, really good system. But of course, you can make it to the World Championships only playing like 2 or 3 regionals in the entire year. So just committing, you know, like 3 weekends or something isn't going to completely break the bank. But obviously, there will be people who are going to be grinding not just to get a Worlds invite, but for that top 16. And that certainly will get more expensive because you're then expected to, you know, in the US at least, there can be regionals on and off, fortnightly, and that's going to be going all across the US essentially.
Wow.
Yeah, it feels like there is a very small amount of people actually doing the sort of bouncing around the US kind of deal, or bouncing around Europe. But it'll probably be like a core of maybe like 50 or so players that see themselves
Hmm.
at that highest level kind of thing. And then there'll be a number of people who only attend ones that are, within 1 or 2 hours reach or something like that. Or, you can still get a world's invite just going to like 1 or 2 and doing well in those events as well. So the threshold isn't super difficult as long as you are experienced in the game and that sort of thing. It
Hmm.
gets harder if you are a newer player, of course, and it may become more of a grind. But throughout that grinding and going to more and more events, you'll be getting better at the game as well. So you'll
Hmm.
sort of be doubling up in that respect, and that you're saving your time later on if you keep
Yeah.
playing Pokemon, because you will become more efficient the more events you go to.
Hmm. Well, it very much makes sense. And I can remember, as an athlete, I played American football when I was in university. And in the recruiting process, when I was still in high school, I was traveling around to a bunch of combines, where it's basically where you could showcase your skill
Hmm.
set and things
Hmm.
like that. And that was a grind in and of itself. Basically, I was going to probably 5, 6, 7 of those just over the course of 3 months during the
Yeah.
summer, and it. I can definitely understand how that can add up quickly. So it is nice with Pokemon that it seems like there is less barrier to entry if
Hmm.
you're practicing and really honing your skills before you step foot onto let's say a couple regional tournaments. You can really set yourself up for success pretty quickly and then make that jump to the world stage.
Yeah, I actually think the barrier to entry is possibly the lowest in the Pokemon TCG compared to every other card game. I think getting your hands on the
Mm,
cards, Pokemon's done a really good job of bringing out some products very recently, actually, things like the League Battle Decks and the Trainer Toolkit.
mhm,
Those products are incredible. I mean, you can spend like 60 US dollars and you can have probably what is the best deck in the format right now in either ADP or Pikarom. Those two decks are literally the strongest in the game, and you can get almost like 40 of the 60 cards just out of one product of a box. So the barrier to entry in terms of acquiring the physical cards is very, very low. And
mhm.
fortunately, that Pokemon's such a popular game that there are plenty of regionals around, plenty of league cups, that sort of thing. So there is ample opportunity for you to get in-person experience, obviously outside of a pandemic. But the
Yeah.
PTCGO is also extremely cheap as well. So if you just want to
Mhm,
hone your skills by playing on the ladder, it's a very popular client, and you're never going to not find a game on that,
mhm.
day or night. So yeah.
Well, and then on top of that, you also host an online league as well, correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's just for content creators, really. That's
Mhm,
mostly actually came out of the pandemic, where uh, a lot of content creators are using real life tournaments to give themselves content for other people to watch. So
mhm,
myself and Jack, we actually came up with this idea to just say, hey, look, let's look out for the content creators. Let's give people something to watch each week. So we actually came up with this league where we'll be pitted against another content creator each week, just so that we're recording something, they're recording something. There's something for people to watch at least, because it can be quite demotivating for players right now when there's nothing to strive for. We don't know
mhm.
when Worlds is coming back. We obviously can't play in regional events, international championships, that sort of thing. And for really high level play, that's a huge gap in your life. Like that's almost every
Yeah.
weekend of my life is going up and down the country or going across borders to
Mhm,
play Pokemon. So it's a huge change in the landscape for what has been the last like 5 years of my life, essentially,
mhm.
when I've been playing at a higher level. Um, so having something there to keep us on our toes, keep us playing regularly, I thought was a really awesome thing. And the league doesn't get a lot of views right now, which is a shame. But it's something that I love doing, and I know a lot of the other content creators are happy to have it there, just because it keeps their channels populated right now.
Mhm. Now, do you see a lot of higher level competitive players also creating content and moving over to YouTube?
So it's still very few people. I think the sort of most flagship player would be Azul Garcia Griego. His channel is called Azul GG. He is
Mhm,
literally the best American player in the world, and pretty much has been more or less in that ranking for the last 5 or so years, I would say. And he does create content. His channel is absolutely fantastic. He streams often as well. There's also a number of other high-profile players that do it, but there's probably around like 30 or so YouTube channels, I would say, like total, talking about the competitive TCG to a pretty high standard, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So, out of all the players, that's still, a very, very small percentage. So, although I do think we have a good number of people talking about the subject, it's still at the end of the day really niche, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a handful of people that create content, but a lot of that as well is spread out into like article writing. I know some people, their creative juices flow via the written word rather than talking into a camera, something like that. So there's also a number of people that prefer that sort of approach, and that's also quite popular for competitive play.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. And it's great that, we're seeing more of a platform for this, because I can foresee that, with the popularity of Pokemon ever increasing, that I think not only are people going to become more interested in collecting cards, but also really getting to the core of what the trading card game was created for. And it's awesome to see you guys really, showcasing your skills and being able to broadcast that, to the wider audience. And, as we were saying before, if you're, maybe if traveling around and competing, a ton isn't really the way that you would want to go. You're also a commentator. So you found
Mhm.
another way to, get onto the world stage and be at these tournaments. How did you make that transition?
Well, Pokemon actually contacted me about it because I was already a content creator sort of in the field. And I think that was some of their first ports of call, people who were already recognizable, already comfortable talking to a camera, that sort of thing. So back in 2016, actually, it was still a system where there were national championships. And I was selected to cast the German, Italian, and UK national championships. And fortunately, they've liked me enough to keep with me throughout international championships as well. And yeah, I mean, it's a great gig. I can't complain. I really enjoy talking about the game as well as playing it. And the pressure's off when you're just commentating on other people playing, which is great, because, anyone can have a bad day. There's obviously a luck element as well as a skill element. So it always
Hmm.
feels like you're winning just by turning up and commentating and having no pressure. And I've done it for so many years now that it's just a really excellent experience. And obviously, exposure wise for the channel and stuff as well, I have to
Hmm.
see that that's added value as well. So just getting my name out there is also something that I thought was extremely valuable. So I do really enjoy the commentary.
Oh, that's so cool. And I mean, you see that, in the sports realm as well, where, former players will then make the
Hmm.
transition over to be a commentator or also an analyst. And this is another thing that I really enjoy about your channel is you really get down into kind of the analysis of deck building. And that's the other thing that I wanted to discuss with you today. What does your current strategy look like, and how are you going about constructing your deck nowadays?
So the Pokemon TCG's got to that level of power creep now. Like I said earlier, games can be between that 5 and 7 turn sort of thresholds that every turn you basically can't miss a beat. Otherwise, you start falling behind quite a lot. There are
Hmm.
cards in the game that can, provide a comeback, and there are certainly decks in the format that rely on your opponent taking a number of prize cards and then punishing them for that action. The closer they
Hmm.
get to winning, you can put the big hurdle in their way where you interact with their hand and essentially stop them drawing cards, which is a big thing. But typically, it's just looking at the statistics of things and trying to give yourself the highest odds every single turn of doing like your plan A. And if you can't make that happen, know what plan B's and C's are out there.
Hmm.
Typically, you're just trying to play the best cards and shove them all into like a synergistic package where they're working off each other well. You, like I said, have a good plan A structure. You have some plan Bs in there as well in terms of what you can attack with, what you can do in terms of what situation you're coming up against. But a big thing is just being aware of what decks are most popular right now, what decks are winning tournaments. Even right now, there are online events going on. So you can get a good grasp of the meta game, which is basically the most popular decks around, and then formulating a strategy against the most popular ones, certainly, but also like the wider field, knowing what approach you can have to win, be it, making sure you're hitting numbers to take knockouts all in one turn, or making sure that your hit points stay out of range, for example. Having different ways to interact with your opponent's board is going to be the approach. So step one really is being aware of what's being played. And then step two is looking at the weaknesses of those decks, or what deck gives you the best chance of coming up against those as often as possible. But, typically there's like 2 or 3 of the decks that are certainly the best in the game. And then there's probably like, I would say around 10 decks in the format that is reasonably viable to achieve wins with. And they can all have different approaches, all have different weaknesses and stuff like that. That's one thing that's quite different in the TCG, is that weakness can play such a big role compared to things like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Hearthstone, those sorts of card games, is because you literally have something that lets you do ×2 damage to whatever is in front of you if you just hit them for weakness. So there's a big type coverage kind of triangle or rock, paper, scissors thing going on as well that you have to try and navigate. And sometimes you're trying to take those calculated risks where you can just sort of anticipate a bad matchup but hope that it's not that popular, or you can try and cover that weakness by having other things in your deck that can interact with that certain archetype. So there's a lot that goes into deck construction. The core of it,
definitely.
the core of it is just get your plan A off as much as possible, because there's so few turns in a game that any missed step will put you quite far behind. But then there's that second element, which is making sure your deck's got a powerful enough strategy and is well-rounded as well to the matchups that you're expecting to see.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's really, in a lot of ways, it sounds like almost a game of chess where you're trying to kind of predict, and especially, obviously chess has more moves, more turns involved. Where you're saying Pokemon is typically what, 5 to 7
Yeah,
turns. So that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for error in that few of turns.
So a lot of people dislike that because it can feel like luck is having a bigger role, because at the moment in the game, you can draw a lot of cards. Decks are 60 card decks of Pokemon cards. And you can draw maybe around like 20 of those cards in one turn if you really want to. So there is that luck element where, like, if you miss what you're looking for in that, third of your deck, it feels quite unfortunate and you get quite frustrated. But also there's a ton of sequencing and improving your odds that can go into drawing those cards. So obviously you still see some of the best players continually doing the best in tournaments, and it's no secret that they are probably playing better than your average player. But yeah, when everything's condensed into a smaller number of turns, luck has a bigger role, but also making sure that sequencing and some other fundamentals are really being nailed every single time.
Interesting. So one of the other things that I have found, obviously card mechanics probably play a big role in determining how you're constructing a deck. I'm interested to hear how you think something like Battle Styles, where it's introducing this new card mechanic of single strike and rapid strike, how that's going to affect the deck construction and the overall competitive play.
Yeah, so we've actually seen something similar to the rapid and single strike stuff before. We've had Team Aqua and Team Magma cards before in the EX era. Essentially, it's just a series of cards that all synergize naturally together is really the core concept of these two things. So decks can sort of sprout out of this little mini package of cards. That was certainly the case for the Team Magma and Aqua era. It won the 2004 World Championships. The SP era in Diamond and Pearl as well was a similar sort of core concept, and that's also been a world's winning strategy before with Lux Chomp. So these are historically very, very good sets of cards. Specifically for battle styles, both sort of strands, the single strike and the rapid strike, have a lot of good synergy and will be powerful archetypes for sure. But really the core concept around it is these cards get to play a certain number of like broken cards all in one package just because they all have the same name. They're all called battle or they're all called rapid or single strike cards. You can only interact with these cards with other rapid and single strike cards. So it's really just sort of making it very obvious to people that these go together and these will be strong together. So it's intuitive to new players as well as experienced players that everything that says single strike should probably go into one deck together and form a strong deck and have a lot of internal synergy helping one another out. And synergy is one of the strongest things in the game. Like you said, those interactions, and that's how the best decks are typically formed. So we will be seeing successful single and rapid strike decks for sure. Both of them, the flagship cards are both Urshifu VMAX cards, and they're both strong in their individual ways. I personally think the rapid strike is going to do a lot better. It looks better on paper to me. It seems more versatile, just in terms of being able to take on a ton of current decks that are in the format. The single strike seems more slow out the gate, but could do better in the long run as we move out of the tag team era and more towards a VMAX era as more Sword and Shield sets come out. So both of them have a lot to like, and I'd love to see single and rapid strike cards continue in like one or two more sets. I think that would be excellent for the game, because historically they're some of the most fun decks to build, and usually extremely competitive as well.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's something, just from a novice perspective, I saw similarities, as you said, to Team Aqua, Team Magma from the past, but had no understanding of like the underlying, gameplay behind it. It just, from the aesthetic standpoint or just the appeal of the card looked very similar. So that's really interesting. So you're putting more of your money now on Rapid Strike.
Yeah.
So there, you heard it here, guys, from Joe himself. It seems that Rapid Strike is probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, but really the kind of the high level difference is that a Rapid Strike deck, or the construction of this, is more tactical. Maybe it's more of kind of wearing down your opponent, whereas the single strike is kind of more like the big knockout blows, trying to end things, or maybe garner prize cards faster. Is that kind of the core of it?
Yeah, I mean, the single strike is doing exactly what it says on the tin. One attack basically can kill anything. Like, it will blow something up in front of it, but it's expensive and it takes a lot to go right to work, kind of thing. Whereas the rapid strike just sort of, you can have suboptimal turns. Things can not go your way, and you'll still be doing, sometimes enough to stay in the game. And then if things are going very well, you can really punish your opponent's side of the field quite aggressively, because it doesn't only attack one Pokemon, it can attack two in any direction that you want. So it can really set up some board states where you've planned not only for the initial knockout right now, but you're either setting things up on the bench to knock them out in future turns, or you're dealing with the active and a bench Pokemon at the same time, which can sometimes stop your opponent drawing cards or accessing other cards. So I think the Rapid Strike will probably tend more towards the highest level of play, but will also be more challenging to play at the same time.
That makes sense. It makes sense because it seems like there's more strategy involved.
It's just more options. So when there's more options, you have to navigate those options better, essentially.
Gotcha. Well, that's really cool. And one of the things that I'm also interested in here is it's all fine and good if you're able to, construct these decks and you've got your strategy together. But I'm also interested to know how a lot of the shortages in cards have impacted the competitive scene. If players are trying to construct their decks, but they're just not able to get their hands on the cards that they really want to put their decks together.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, because there isn't so much in real life play, it hasn't become a big issue. But and hopefully there's only this shortage because of a pandemic. So when we're post pandemic, we will be able to get all the cards that we need. But there is going to be, for any cards that are useful from Vivid Voltage, Darkness Ablaze, those sorts of sets, there could be a shortage, because essentially players are completely reliant on other people opening products, because once they open the product, they sell the singles or they sell the bulk, and then we're the ones buying the singles oftentimes. We cherry pick. Sometimes there are only like 15 or 20 cards in a set of 200 that seem viable or useful to you. And some people, they'll choose one deck and play that for the entire season. Some people, whenever a new set comes out, they want to have the options for all different things. So it depends on a player's budget a lot of the time as well. But most of the time, we're going to be stingy. We're just going to try and pick, a play set of item cards here and a play set of Pokemon there, and mash that into a deck from the cards we already have.
Hmm.
So obviously players will open product as well at good amounts, and price support is oftentimes booster packs and boxes. People can either choose to open those or sell those. It's it could be a 50-50 split. I don't really know the split, but I see a lot of product being opened on a Sunday in regional championships. So I'd imagine most people like to open packs at the same time.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think we are really reliant on collectors opening product because, like you say, if everyone's buying product just to keep it sealed, there will be
Yeah.
demand for some of the cards eventually
Hmm.
when tournaments are back. And yeah, if there is shortages, it would create a different angle of demand, which really hasn't been there in the market right now because of
Hmm.
the situation that we're in.
Yeah, and that's true. That's something that I didn't really think about is that, even though we don't have the same kind of manpower, same type of printing power right now, we also don't have tournaments that are
Yeah.
actually going
Yeah.
on.
We don't, yeah.
So,
At the moment, I'm not buying singles like I would for tournaments kind of thing. So, yeah.
hmm. Hmm.
And pretty
Oh, that.
much everyone's waiting until we know that we can play again.
Hmm. Well, and you mentioned something there that I've reiterated on my channel is that I don't think people realize how symbiotic of a relationship there really is between collectors, the competitive players, and I would also include investors in there as well. I think people often have this idea that there's like this schism, like you're either a collector or you're an investor or you're a competitive player. And to me, from what I've seen in being involved in this, predominantly in collecting and investing, is that it really takes both for kind of everything to operate. Because very
Mm.
often I have been in contact, when I'm looking to invest in a product, I'm in contact with collectors and, garnering information about, hey, what do you think about this card, from a collection standpoint? And then, from the same, just vice versa, if you're a collector, very often it's investors that are able to find these products. They're really the ones that dig deep, that go into the analytics and the data, and can really bring some of these products that maybe are lesser known to light. And then you have really brought to life the fact that competitive players, you're also reliant on at least collectors for the most part in
Mm.
opening product and really bringing those to the open market for you guys to include.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because we haven't really seen the ratios when players come back, how much of an effect it will have on the sort of new wave of investors that like to keep product for themselves and keep them sealed,
Hmm.
trying to look in a 5-year reach kind of thing, because, players only care about them for 2 years,
Yeah,
and then they
yeah.
rotate, right? So
Hmm.
the ratio of people holding boxes compared to opening boxes could have a real impact on card prices. But the hope would be that if prices start going up on the cards, there's more reason for people to open and sell the packs, right? So the hope
Hmm.
would be that people holding those boxes could start, selling those off, or opening them and selling the contents, because there will be pendulum swinging one way or the other, where
Hmm.
there can be value either way, So yeah, we haven't really seen the effect of investor hoarding style stuff
Hmm.
because we know it's going on. People are stacking those
Oh, for
shells
sure.
and taking the whole thing, and that's not happened before. So
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that interacts if it's still going on post pandemic.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I kind of have my own sentiments in regards to that, where I think what we're seeing right now with the massive hoarding, and I've seen it myself. I'm a part of sealed collector pages and
Mm.
areas like that. And I think once post pandemic, once we get out of this unique period of time, personally, I don't think you're going to see near as much of that hoarding going on, because
I would
I
hope
also
not.
think of
Yeah.
you would, yeah, you would hope not. But I think also just from, we'll get out of this current paradigm that we're in, where there is a shortage of products just because we don't
Yeah.
have the same type of manpower. But we'll definitely get to the collecting and investing here shortly, because I
Sure,
know
sure.
you are well versed in that as well. But really, my last question for you here in relation to the competitive realm is, I'm interested to know like what your main goal is when it comes to, you've been doing this for quite a while now. What is the end all goal for Joe, and how do you plan to get there?
So I have two goals. The first is to commentate a World Championships. I think that would be an incredible personal goal. And another goal is to get a trophy card at the World Championships as well. So both worlds related goals. I think on the commentary side, it's mostly out of my hands because I've been doing internationals plenty. But typically, the World Championships is done in the US, and they have a US casting team. And there are complications of having people outside the US working inside the US. And I think they've tried that for some video game people, and they were stopped at customs for a few days. So I would
Mhm.
imagine my only chance of commentating the World Championships would be if it was outside the US. Now, I was really rooting for London
Yeah, I was gonna
Worlds
say.
2020. I thought that was going to be my best chance. So I really am crossing my fingers that it can one day come back to Europe. Not saying that it means I definitely would be commentating, but it gives me more than a 0% chance, which I think is
Mhm.
the current chance I have, unless I move to the US to live and work. Yeah, commentating and then playing. I mean, I play a ton of Pokemon. I have been for many years. I go to every single World Championships because I commentate the international championships. Typically, I do often get the day one Worlds invite rather than that day two invite, which gives you obviously a much better advantage in the overall tournament because you effectively skip 9 rounds of play. And
Wow.
you're straight into that second tournament. That essentially the tournament resets on that day two. Everyone's records reset from day one. Either there's a
Mhm.
cutoff of you made it or you didn't kind of thing, and then the real tournament in air quotes starts on that second day. So really just
Oh, real
trying
quick here,
to.
Joe. Quick question for you. So, do they essentially, after day one, do they just basically shuffle everybody again, and then whoever has made it to that second day will play each other, or is it like an actual bracket where there's rankings and you go
So
through that?
yeah, so there'll be a ton of people who get knocked out on that first day. They're just
Hmm.
out the tournament if they don't, if they have, I think like 3 losses, typically they're just out essentially
Hmm.
in a 9 round sort of thing. So then there's normally a large open event the next day, which anyone can attend, but essentially people who were booted out of day one will typically go and play in the open that second day. But you're just there for the world's experience anyway. There's still tons of side events going on the entire weekend, but yeah, the day two of the event, the Saturday, is only those people who did very well in that first day, and then the people who have done well consecutively throughout the season. They all start from zero, and it's Swiss tournaments. So there'll be, I think it's like 6 or 7 rounds, and then it's just based on record whether or not you make it into the top 32, and then you just keep going and keep going.
Mm.
Swiss, and then it's a top 8 cut, and then it's singular limb from top 8 essentially.
Wow, wow, that's
Mhm.
got to be draining. That's a lot
It's
of games.
I mean, yeah, it's a lot of games. I think most regional events will be the same. It will be 9 rounds, day one Swiss, then day two, there will be another round of another like 5 or 6 rounds of Swiss, and then top cut as well. So if you, the deeper you go into the tournament, the longer the weekend becomes. You can spend
Wow.
like 20 hours playing Pokemon if you're there
Wow.
throughout. So yeah, it can be pretty intense for these larger tournaments.
Crazy, crazy. So I sorry that I cut you off there, but
No, fair.
so really the next goal, beyond the commentating at Worlds, the trophy card is really, getting onto that top tier stage competitively, correct?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like I'll never say no to a commentary gig, but usually it means that I'll only be playing in the North American International Championships each year, which is the largest tournament of the year and is obviously a very difficult one. So far, it's been a tough nut to crack for me, but hopefully, you know, just trial and error. Essentially, I play so many games, and I have been playing at a relatively high level. I think like statistically, I've been like top 50 of Europe the last like 5 years, top 10 of my country in the last 5 years. So I'm playing at a high standard, and it's just having extra experience with the deck. Just having ultimately there are luck elements. So there's going to be days where you have a bad run and put it down to that, but trying to make sure that you just limit as many mistakes as possible is all you can really do. making sure you have some very human things like water with you, food with you, make sure you have enough sleep, that sort of thing as well.
Hmm.
It's something that isn't always going to happen for you, but if it's something that I'm trying to be more conscious of for future tournaments to try and do my best.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, I can imagine that it all, bringing all of that together in one package, having your mind right, your body right, and also, being prepared strategically, having,
Hmm.
practiced and gone through all of that. I mean, really that permeates throughout, no matter what sport it is you're
Sure.
playing.
Yeah.
So that totally makes sense. Um, I guess my last question here for you is, do you think that they're actually, or are they still planning on holding Worlds in London, or are they considering moving it now?
I mean, they said that it would have been in 2020. It would have been London, and I'm hoping it would have been in 2021. But I think it's also unlikely. It is August time, but I don't know if we will be able to hold large scale events at that sort of point. So, it
Hmm.
may not be Worlds until 22, and I don't know what they'll do then. We'll have to see where the world is in 2022. So I can't give you any
Yeah.
sort of indication. It was a good sign that they wanted it to still be in London. I would really like it to be in London. Obviously, it was announced at Worlds where the next Worlds location would be. That's always like the big send off that Pokemon give us, kind of thing, to get us
Hmm.
excited for the next season. And it would be the first time that it would be held outside the US, which would be really, really exciting. So, yeah, I think it's something that a lot of people. It was kind of a contentious decision in the first place, just to hold it outside the US. But I'd be really excited for it to come to the UK. So I really do hope that when Worlds is finally back, it will be in the UK.
Well, I do too. My wife and I like to do a lot of traveling, and I already told her. I said, "Honey, if as soon as they announce that it's a go for Worlds, we're buying our ticket because
Nice,
that
nice.
we can travel around London. I can go to Worlds, but just and it's kind of baffling to me that it is the first time that it's been held
Mm,
outside of the US, because Pokemon is such a worldwide brand and there's so many players across the entire world. It is strange that that they've only held it in the US. It's
yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say on that is looking at like my own channel analytics. I would say it literally tells me that it's 50% US people, and then rest of world is the other 50%. So
hmm,
the largest player base is the US, undoubtedly for tournament play. Um, Again, like possibly outside of Japan, I don't actually know the player numbers for the Japanese meta because it's just so alien to me.
mhm.
But yeah, the US is certainly the most popular for the TCG.
Mm. Well, and I mean that kind of makes sense. I can understand that because, same thing if I look at my analytics as well, pretty much the same way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I would say also, collectors and investors, I would say the largest swath is probably in the US,
For sure,
North
for sure.
America.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Well, very cool, Joe. That was really insightful, man. And like I said, that was the area that I'm most unfamiliar with when it comes
Hmm.
to the TCG, is the competitive arena. So you might have sparked enough interest in me
Hopefully.
to start dabbling in it a little bit. So I'm sure,
You must have
maybe.
codes lying around somewhere, right?
Oh, I've got a ton of them, a ton of them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I usually honestly give those to my daughter because she likes to try to get into them, and so I'll say, okay, here you go, you take the code cards, but I might actually have to put those to use now. But what I'm really interested now, Joe, is as I said before, you are well versed in all three areas of the TCG. So now I'd like to go ahead and get into the collecting and investing side
Cool.
and see how the competitive arena ties into that. So my first question for you is, having been in this for quite some time now and being involved in all three areas, how much of an influence does the competitive aspect of Pokemon have on the collecting and investing side?
So I think its largest impact is in modern. As we said earlier, competitive players want to have these cards for their functionality a lot of the time. And being aware of when a rotation happens, what sets are rotating out, and that sort of thing, that will typically have a huge uh, change in prices because, you know, as soon as cards rotate, all the players sell those cards. So if you're collecting modern sets, you know, sometimes there are things like Jirachis from Team Up, or, you know, Zapdos from Team Up, just regular like holographic cards that have a really inflated price tag compared to most other easy to pull holographic cards, because people want to grab 4 copies of that card for tournament play. So if your opening product, being aware of what cards are playable could mean that you could sell those cards for more, like sort of day one, and then buy them back in 2 years' time if you have that sort of patience, because there will be a wave of them coming back onto the market when players don't need these cards anymore. You know, I'm someone who collects sets and have collected sets, you know, throughout the years, and that's typically my strategy. If it's not like a full art card or something like that, if it's just a functional card that has a high price tag, I will try and buy those once those sets rotate, because it's typically way easier to find those cards. And like I said, cards normally stay in standard for about 2 years. So like at this point, I'd be looking to fill gaps in like Lost Thunder and other some of those Sun and Moon sets, because they're still modern enough to find and quite easily acquire. But the player base has now forgotten about them, or not, you know, they've already thrown them back to, you know, Card Market, Magic Madhouse, TCG Player, Troll and Toad, those sorts of things. They've given those sorts of things up. In terms of going back to previous years and looking at price tags that may look strange, I think sometimes, again, having awareness of the competitive side will help you out. I also think for population reports as well, specifically for PSA 10s, is going to be hopefully, or I imagine that it will carve itself out at some point, where you'll see highly playable cards will likely have a lower PSA 10 pop report compared to other populations. Now, right now, I don't think we have enough information on enough cards to know that for certain. Some of the only cards I can really think of is possibly things like Base Set Unlimited Hitmonchan, because that was one of the strongest cards back in the day. I think Unlimited Base Set is one of the only like fleshed out pop reports really in any regard. And Hitmonchan has a lower 10 rate than even a number of the like colorless Pokemon, which we typically associate with being hard PSA 10s, right? The colorless types with silver backgrounds, the Chanseys and the Clefairies, and Hitmonchan would kind of fall into that category because so many people would have opened Base Set Unlimited Hitmonchan and played with those. I think specifically for Unlimited more than first edition, because players wouldn't have played with first edition cards. And then that could translate over to, you know, sets as we go through as well. Now, I think outside of WotC, a ton of sets don't have a hugely fleshed out pop report yet, because there hasn't been a market for enough years really in the hobby. I think that's only really been established over the last like 2 years, possibly, where that popularity has ramped up in not only the WotC things. So yeah, you'll see random cards like Neo Genesis Sneasel was just a regular rare, and it'll be a hard 10 to acquire because it was crazy, crazy strong. One thing that I always find interesting is the Neo Genesis Slowking. Not only is known for like horrific print lines and that sort of thing, but that was actually a banned card as well for how strong it was in the time. It was errated because it was extremely strong, because it forced coin flips for your opponent to do like basically any action, which was incredibly difficult. So I think as pop reports flesh out, you'll start seeing those strange nuances that maybe you know, it's not easy to understand just out the gate, but it probably will be because of popularity of the playability of these cards. But at the same time, Pokemon has always been collected probably a lot more than played. As we said from the start, you know, there's, you know, a very niche amount of people who play Pokemon. I would say outside of like casual play, it's probably a core of maybe like 10,000 players, I would say, like conservatively 10 to 20,000 players that, you know, travel around to regional tournaments, that sort of thing, across the globe, really. So that's still a tiny, tiny portion of people compared to who actually open packs and collect for fun and stuff. So we may actually never see that nuance in population, but if it was going to be anywhere, it would be in the PSA 10s and how low that ratio would be comparatively. And what else could I really say on the matter? I think if you're opening product for yourself, yeah, like I said, you can make more money if you keep an eye on what other people want and, you know, how playable those things are. I think looking at buy lists from competitive channels can give you great insight, because you could just throw away random rare cards like Cephalon from Unbroken Bonds, not knowing that it was like actually a £5 card or something, because it's a really powerful card that you can be playing in decks. And trainer cards like Dragon Majesty, Fiery Flints, like random cards that you don't care about because, you know, you need one for your binder maybe if you're completing the set, and then all the others are useless. Whereas, players will want to have like 12 copies of Guzma, 12 copies of Acerola, and all these sorts of things. So, they're not only building one deck at a time. Some people like to have complete decks all over the place, and some people like to go back to previous eras and have collections from like 2012, 2015, times in the game that they enjoyed or, started off with, that sort of thing. And they want multiple copies because that's just the nature of the card game.
No, it's really interesting because now, you're kind of opening people's minds to another another segment of the market that I think is often overlooked, and that is, the preferences of the competitive players. And it's not just in, from the sounds of it, it's not just in what is currently playable, but also what maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago was also a very popular card in the playable scene. So there is some nostalgia for competitive players as well.
For sure. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I feel nostalgic about cards that you probably wouldn't even like know about, like just random uncommons from sets, I don't know, just throwing one off the top of my head. Like my first regionals win was with a Vespiquen, which is an uncommon from Ancient Origins. Like, why would any collector care about that card? But then the player base, some people absolutely adore that card.
Yeah.
There'll be people who played that for a year and have a ton of nostalgia around the decks of the time and that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's a ton of nuance to these sorts of things. And I personally feel the collector market is very unaware. And it, unless you're also a player as well, you won't intuitively know these things or know what was strong at the time, because looking at something from 5 years ago doesn't really make sense because you didn't know the full metagame at the time. You didn't know what decks were trying to beat each other and what was popular and what other mechanics were going on at the time. So you can't just look at a card and say, yeah, that's definitely would have been good at the time, because you don't know what was circulating around the whole thing. So yeah, I would like to think that the pop reports, once fleshed out, would eventually start to show those peaks and troughs kind of thing of what was always a collector card only compared to what was divided up between collectors and players. I think, even out of the gate of Unbroken Bonds, the Reshiram and Charizard was an extremely playable card, as well as an extremely collectible card, because it's a Charizard, there was a Rainbow Rare, there was a Full Art. So seeing that division of people, because some people like to play with maxed out rarity decks as well. So there'll be a number of ruined Rainbow Reshizards, essentially, because it was really, really playable. But there won't be a number of ruined, like, Burning Shadows Charizards, unless, I mean, the print run was bad, so there are a number of those ones, but not because of the players. That was just because of the print runs instead. So yeah.
Would you say that, just obviously you can pay attention to the competitive scene, you can pay attention to, your channel and some of the other content creators who are also, bigger time players as well. But I'm thinking back, and I'm wondering if, along with that and looking at the PSA pop reports, if looking at some of the world championship deck boxes that come out, you might be familiar with those, especially going back. I think they go back as far as 2004, if I'm not mistaken.
That's the first official Nintendo World Championships. Yeah.
Now, would looking at those also give somebody maybe a heads up on what would be potentially something that you would want to look at investing in, that would also be something a competitive player would be looking at?
Certainly for like the trainer cards and the engines, really, that is pretty much a copy and paste for a ton of decks would have played the same sorts of cards. If you go to snapshots of certain eras, you'll see, if you go back to early EX eras, like everyone would play Pidgeot from Fire Red Leaf Green because it had an insane ability, a draw engine. If you jump to the Diamond and Pearl era, everyone was playing Claydol because it drew a bunch of cards, that sort of thing. So you'll be able to see patterns emerge year on year on what cards is showing up in the same deck over and over again to give you a good idea of what was really playable. You may be surprised about things like Jolteon Gold Star was in a world's winning deck, like Lugia EX from Unseen Forces, very, very playable card. Blastoise EX from Fire Red Leaf Green, those sorts of cards, extremely, extremely playable cards. Like you said, you can learn that information quite easily from the World Championship decks. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go out and buy the World Championship decks, but you can go on Bulbapedia and look at all of the World Championship decks and see what's within all of them and give you a good idea of what was played, at least for the World Championships. And that's not necessarily everyone's favorite format. That's not necessarily like the most iconic or whatever, but it certainly gives you a good indication sort of year on year how the game has changed. And I personally love those World Championship decks, by the way. I think they do terribly in terms of investment value at the moment, but they are such cool pieces of history. And for a player, they are so nostalgic and so incredible. It's one of my favorite parts of my collection because it ticks both boxes in terms of I can look at the game and how it's progressed, but I can also think about the worlds back then and, appreciate that these things were like 15, 20 years ago and shows you how far we've come really as a game.
Well, and I really want to flesh this one out with you, Joe, because it was probably a few months ago. I was doing kind of an overlooked, undervalued series, and one of the products that I had suggested looking at were these World Championship decks, because I was really looking at it from the same standpoint that we are here today. These are something that were these were the decks that were constructed by the best players, and it would make sense to me that if these were a part of the best decks, then a lot of other players would be constructing their decks similarly. And we've already kind of verified the fact that looking at these cards during those eras will probably put you in a better position for long-term value for individual cards. But what do you think about those World Championship decks? As you said, right now, they're not really worth much, but over the long term, do you think that there is potential investment value there? As the competitive players, as you said, you look on these very similarly to what maybe we look at as collectors that we were collecting as children, or maybe when we got back into Pokemon.
It's hard to say really, because I think you could quite easily still just proxy up those decks, which from my experience, players are much more happy to like proxy up a deck. Like you're never going to see a collector print out cards for their binder, whereas players can print out cards for the functionality aspect and still play with, just an energy, and then you put the card in, like you cut out a piece of paper and put that in the sleeve and play with those decks. And also at the same time, there will be a number of cards which are extremely cheap, and a lot of the time you're buying trainers and that sort of thing. But admittedly, it is more expensive to be that sort of labor of love of going back to like 07 or something and trying to build those decks of that year. So at the moment, they are a very good sort of budget value way that you can experience those eras. I think they'll always remain budget personally, because they don't have, like, I don't think many collectors would ever want them. Now, I know some like Charizard cards are within the Charizard set registry, so there are exceptions to that rule. Yeah, I think also one other thing specifically with those Worlds decks is one thing that I find quite annoying about them is that if you want to have any personal preference change, or if you want to experiment with something different or put a tech in for a certain matchup, you have to put in a real card which has a different border and a different back to all the other things. Now, obviously, you're sleeving these decks up if you want to play with them, but it would stand out like a sore thumb, and sometimes it can look a little bit weird. So some people would prefer to build those decks and use those as a basis, but then make like 5 or 6 changes. So they'd try and construct those decks with real cards, which I think is a small drawback. But in terms of getting those sealed deck boxes, I do think they still will do quite well. They come with a really awesome booklet, which really gives you nostalgic vibes, or it's a ton of photographs of the tournament. You get to see literally just like, it's just such wholesome, feels good kind of stuff. You get really good information about why those decks were strong at the time, and you get interviews with players as well within those booklets. So I think those are really awesome. I don't think they necessarily look like showpieces, but a lot of the old sort of plastic ones, they show like the 2 big cards of the deck or whatever. So they can look good as, just sort of standing up one by one sort of thing, keeping them sealed. So I think they are probably a little bit undervalued, but I don't see them being extremely expensive or wanted by like a mass audience. It would only really be for players, I would say, for the most part, that are wanting to get back into those older generations. But ultimately, because there is not much of a price tag on them, they are quite scarce, because there's no reason for people to sell if they do have sealed ones.
Yeah.
I'm personally still looking for some to complete my own collection, and I am pulling
Hmm.
my hair out most times just because I can't find the things that I want, because I
Hmm.
would be willing to pay more for them, but they're just literally not on the market at all right now because
Wow.
people see low price tags and assume that it's pointless to put their things up for sale.
Hmm.
So personally, I'd like a, I think they could each go for like $100, $200 for some of the older ones. I know there are a handful that do go for a lot. There was a certain year, I think it was 2011, where there was Ross Cawthon's deck called The Truth, came with a Tropical Beach inside it. And because Tropical Beach was actually super expensive at the time, people cracked open that World Championship deck just to get a copy of the beach so that they could proxy that card. So
Hmm.
that one is going to be specifically different to a lot of the other World Championship decks for sure.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. I was, and that was one of the products that I was interested to get your take on, because it does seem to hit a lot of those different aspects where it seems collectible, it seems investable. It also seems, nostalgic for the competitive players. And yeah, like I caught, I caught so much flack for recommending those. A lot of people are like, well, they're not even real cards. They're just like knockoffs.
Yeah,
And one of the things that people have to realize is it doesn't always have to be a product that is a part of the mainline TCG
sure.
to garner value. We can look at tops,
That's
some of
changed a
these
lot
other,
this year. I think those
a
sorts of
lot.
non-TCG cards have really picked up pace. I think they've been ignored for way too long, and there are some, the markets become much more aware of them and respect them a lot more, like you said, this year for
Mhm.
sure.
I just recently became aware of, I believe they were like 1999, 2000 actual playing cards. So
Hmm.
not TCG, just actual like what you would play poker with,
Yep, yep.
and those are going for really good
Markets,
prices right now.
yeah, the market's really liking those so far. Some
Yeah,
excellent
yeah.
artworks, I'd admit for sure, but I don't know the
Oh,
scarcity of
definitely.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about is, we're talking about the collecting and the investing side. So I'm interested to hear, from being a competitive player, do you think that the price tag, you talked about one of your big goals was to get a trophy card. I'm interested to hear if you think that the price tag on things like trophy cards are warranted, based upon their scarcity and what we're seeing those go for right now.
Yeah, I think personally, I still think they're underrated in the hobby. They are extremely low print, and they are every player's dream, probably, I would say, to win themselves. I think that's one reason possibly why no players really want to buy them. It's because they'd rather earn the card, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So it only really
Hmm.
appeals to collectors, and it only sort of appeals to high-end collectors as well because of the price tag that they do garner. Um, I think they're not intuitively known about from a lot of the community. Like we started at the beginning of this conversation, a lot of people don't know that there even is this sort of competitive world going on, and that there are still tournaments to this day. Whereas a lot of people may have assumed that the TCG kind of died many years ago. So a lot of people may not have that same connection to the World Championships, which I do think is a small drawback to them. So at the moment, I think it's only a handful of very dedicated collectors that care about these cards. But
Hmm.
I think that sentiment could easily change. They could become much more wanted. A lot of them have Pikachu on them, which certainly helps the card, I would say, because then you're starting to get into other collectors will want it just because it has a Pikachu on it, that sort of thing. Obviously, a lot of the older trophy cards are incredibly difficult to find. You basically won't ever find raw copies anymore unless you're extremely lucky, or literally targeting and trying to find the players of those tournaments and tracking them down and trying to see if
Hmm.
they'd sell them to you. So incredibly difficult cards to acquire in the first place, because even if the people who win them, you never know if they actually want to sell them or not. They've probably just won a good amount of money from the actual World Championship tournament or whatever tournament they've come to. So they're not in dire need of cash either. So there's also that sort of psychological elements where why offer someone money when they've just received a bunch kind of thing. So yeah, I believe they're totally underrated. I'd love to win one for myself. if I have to buy one, I may try one day. So yeah, they're definitely ones. Yeah, some of the best cards in the hobby, no doubt, in my mind.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think they're starting to get the notoriety that they actually deserve because they're one of the few cards, in my opinion, in the hobby where we have very solid numbers on their actual supply. You know, we were
Hmm.
talking about how the PSA 10 pop reports can flesh out with various indicators, but we don't really know because that information isn't provided to us about
Sure.
what print runs were. Trophy cards are really the only ones where we can be pretty confident, or perhaps even 100% confident in how many are actually out there, especially at the biggest of tournaments.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the supply side is really impossible to tell for a ton of people. It's a very abstract concept, just how many packs get opened and sold. But for these cards, you can have no doubt that they are extremely, extremely rare and that
Hmm.
only a handful of people can own these. So, yeah, the price tag, I believe, is still low and has a ton more room to grow. But it's also indicative of the sort of age range of the market that we're in right now. Our spending power is currently low and probably will increase over the next 10, 15 years. So I
Hmm.
believe those are some of the safest places to plant your money as a long-term
Yeah.
investment.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. And talking about time horizons here, one of the things that you mentioned here that I think is really important is the amount of time that sets are in rotation. And I
Hmm.
want to get into this because one of the big areas of concern, especially with modern products, is if you're wanting to invest in these, especially for the short term, and I consider that 5 years or less. One of the concerns that you have is reprints and that affecting the value. Now, you said with the competitive rotation, that's typically about 2 years, correct?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
So after that, after these cards are out of rotation, and honestly, it makes total sense to me because that's typically when we start to see sets increase in value. Now, again, I'm going to say that there is a caveat here with what the time that we're currently in. A Vivid Voltage booster box, which was released just late last year and now is going for like $250. These are kind of one-offs given the time that we're in. But looking back in the past, especially from the time that I started back in 2016, that's typically what you would see is about 2 to 3 years. That's when a set would start increasing in value. Do you think that it's in part due to that? Once it's out of rotation, it has a less likelihood of Pokemon wanting to reprint these sets?
For sure. I think there's basically no incentive of a reprint post the sets rotating. Um, Evolution's probably the only exception to that because it was never seen as a player's set anyway. It was always a
Hmm.
collector's set. Probably the best cards from Evolutions was like rare Starmie and the rare Mewtwo, which are extremely common cards to find, right? I think the Dragonite EX was actually quite playable as well, but even that, half art sort of thing, you could quite
Hmm.
easily get those for the player base. But um, yeah, I think possibly there's more market confidence in those products, like you say, because they then think there is not going to be a reprint for them. So you can start thinking about, you know, there isn't going to be more of these hitting the market. So you're not going to get completely wiped back down to the sort of roaring skies effect or whatever else when they
Hmm.
did just sort of turn the printers back on for those sets. So I think there is something around that. I do think that more often than not, it's probably people just wanting to get the mint condition copies for collecting side, which is the reason why prices go up rather than collectors. Oh, sorry, rather than players, because at that point there's been so many products already opened from that any cards you want from a playability standpoint you could probably acquire for a much
Hmm.
cheaper amount than just buying the boxes. And realistically, the amount of boxes you would have to buy as a player to actually fulfill what you wanted from a single set, it's going to be quite a lot. So I would be amazed if there are players going back now to EX sets or Diamond and Pearl sets, even black and white sets. There will not be players buying those boxes to open for themselves for a playability standpoint. It just makes no logical sense in terms of what you can pull in to make decks. So I think players will probably only be buying singles, and it would still be driven by collectors. So if you are anticipating those sorts of price rises, it's probably collectors being more confident that there won't be more printed, and collectors either looking back at sets or the market getting larger, and those people haven't experienced the set in the first place. I think it will have very little to do with the playability side personally, because I would have thought it would be easier to acquire those cards within the set, loose and raw, post the rotation, because there'll be so many people who have abandoned those sets at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and again, like you said, that'll also be a good time to get an understanding of those PSA 10 pop reports. Once we hit about that 2-year time horizon, you'll have an idea at that point of cards that might have been, even if you're not paying close attention to the competitive scene, you looking at those population reports, you'll probably have a good indication at that point of cards that are going to be, sought after moving forward.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to think so, at least. I think
Yeah.
for modern, the pop reports are already climbing at such rapid paces that it just, there may never be a huge carve out difference between the populations for playable and non-playable, because so many people are buying for collection purposes or whatever. But PSA grading is still quite young. I think, if I had asked a ton of the player base about PSA grading, there would probably only have been about 10% people that would have known about PSA. Whereas like today, 100% of people would know from the player base that PSA grading is a thing now. So yeah, that's been a real change in like mentality around these cards. So even players now know to insta-sleeve things and set things aside for collection and only play with the min rarity instead.
Well, and I mean, along with, all of your other attributes, you also have a fantastic collection, especially vintage collection. And I know, I've heard some of the podcasts that you've been on before, and also watched some of your videos on your personal collection. And you got into it at a pretty good time. What, around like 2009 was when you really started collecting these, especially WotC sets?
Yeah.
And
2009 to 2012, I think I was opening the most WotC product. Yeah.
wow. And and what a good time to do that.
Yeah.
Compared to, what we're experiencing now, it's just a night and day difference. But I'm interested to know, how close you are to actually finishing off your collection. I know you were, just as of recently, looking to kind of upgrade from PSA 9s to PSA 10s, and kind of how close you are to that overall goal.
Yeah. So a very blanket goal is to complete all first edition WotC sets. And apart from first edition base, because I was initially like a teenager when I was opening like these boxes and stuff, and they were obviously extremely cheap back then compared to what they are now. So the landscape's extremely different. But even back then, first edition base was out of my price range, and as soon as I've earned more money, the first edition prices have gone further still. So it's never been on my own personal radar, unfortunately. But yeah, I'm about 80% of the way there. In terms of physical cards, I think I'm over 80% there in terms of value, because I've got the Charizards of all the sets, and I think I have like 3 Neo Destiny Shinings to go, which are probably the most expensive ones. I still have a number of Neo and Aquapolis cards that I still need to acquire. So these are some of the ones that are just harder to come by a lot of the time, especially when most of the time I'm buying from the European market, which is just far less populated than the US market. Now, I have bought cards from the US. I got my Shadowless Charizard from PokéRev, actually.
Oh,
like
nice.
in 2015. So I have done high scale purchases from the US at times, and I may be having to look to do that again, just because there's just not enough on sale in the UK or in Europe or whatever. But yeah, I'm pretty close. I'm hoping that I can get it done in the next year, 2 years would be really what I'm looking for. At the moment, I'm being very passive with my purchasing, only really going for Skyridge and Aquapolis cards at the moment, is really where I'm trying to focus right now. because I believe those are going to be the most resistant to price decreases just by their population. So I think those are the safest things I can look for right now. But hopefully when there's some stability in the market, I'll go out and look for some of these other things that I need to still complete.
Well, unfortunately, I think that 2021 is probably going to be an even crazier year than 2020, especially as of recent developments. So I think that, like you said, looking for some of those more stable type of cards right now, and as you said, a more passive investing style is probably a good idea.
I'm basically a tortoise. I could have been a lot quicker and have probably finished it by now, but I've always been slow and steady with the approach, and never felt like that I have to acquire the card today. There'll be a day where I do get it. So I'm just slowly whittling away at it.
Definitely. Well, I'm excited to see it. Honestly, man, that is such a cool goal, and honestly one that I think a lot of people aspire to, and it'll be really neat when the day comes to fruition that we can all see that. But Joe, my last question for you here, this is really to kind of tie kind of everything together, because you have such a good understanding of all three areas: collecting, investing, and competitive play. Where do you see the biggest opportunities, both now and moving forward, for collectors and investors? And what are also some of the biggest mistakes that you see collectors and investors making now, that you think should be rectified as they move into the future?
I think just by the nature of the market, the amount of people that have only just got involved, I think there is a very high focus on modern right now because it's just easier to acquisition. But I believe personally that there will be, with greater experience, with greater knowledge in the hobby, a greater draw to the older sets and a greater draw into the nostalgic sets. I think that's where the most value is personally. And I think a lot is overvalued right now just because of the market activity going on. But I still believe that in terms of longevity, the oldest cards will have the best staying power in terms of value. I do think specifically based on pop reports that we have to go off of right now, the Neo sets and the e-reader sets and early EX era sets, they have a very good chance of being some of the most difficult to acquire. So will be eventually some of the most expensive things in the hobby, I believe. There's a ton of great exclusive art Japanese sets out there from the, around sort of 2003 and earlier kind of thing. A ton of first appearance artworks for cards as well, even non-TCG, which we've already touched on earlier. And I personally think people who go down that rabbit hole, they'll want a ton of variety. They'll want a ton of different artworks. The vending series is great. The Versus series is great. Cardass Bandai cards, fantastic artworks all around. So much nostalgia there. The CD promos, Masaki promos, like T magazine. There's so many aspects of Pokemon. There's a ton of good areas that you can look at, unfortunately. But I believe that at the moment there's a big knowledge gap, and I personally think there will be a eventual cool off on modern, especially when we start seeing the pop reports start coming back and we start seeing just how many there are of these cards and that they are not difficult to acquire. I think naturally collectors want to find the things that are harder to get and do make you sort of stand out from a crowd. From a collector standpoint, is that you want to get something that not many people can. That's kind of the nature of collecting in a lot of ways. So I think that's where the sentimentality will eventually get to. I just think that right now so many people are getting in. It's an easier entry point for people price wise, and the fact that it can be picked from a store shelf, that there is such an allure to modern, and because you open some modern packs, then you want to complete that modern set. So there's a ton of exposure around modern right now that I think will wane as more people get more experienced in the hobby. That's my own sentiment though. And that's not to hate on modern. I open every modern set. so I still enjoy collecting the sets as well, and they are fun. But I personally think that the individual card PSA slab values for modern is where I'm most concerned, I would say.
Mhm. Mhm. And I totally agree with you. I think your sentiment there of there being quite a knowledge gap is dead on. And
Hmm.
for me, one of my big focal points of starting my channel was to really one, bringing my financial perspective, my financial experience, bringing people kind of back down to earth, but also providing a platform where I could project people like yourself out there to the wider community to really give people that holistic perspective on
Hmm.
things. So I think that knowledge gap it will narrow as we move
Yeah.
forward. And I think you're absolutely right. I think right now we're in the infancy of Pokemon, and we're kind of in that, both from a chronological standpoint, but also kind of from a investor collector maturity
Mm,
standpoint, where I
for
think a
sure.
lot of people are just going for what they're seeing on social media, what they're seeing influencers advocating, and then also what is most popular, what is most recognizable to them, either from their childhood or from modern day. But I think as I said, as that knowledge gap starts to narrow, you're gonna see people start to make more of a push into the more obscure, more of the nostalgic, more of the one-offs, the limited print type of cards. You listed a lot of good ones there, versus Cardus, vending series. A lot of these like pre 2003 Japanese products. I think there's going to be even more of a push in that direction. And to me, that's really a good indication that the hobby is headed in the right direction. That means that they're probably studying PSA pop reports more. They're probably looking more at data, and all this being said, a collector, what you enjoy is always going to be subjective. It's whatever you enjoy. So I think that even things like modern will still be popular, especially from a collection standpoint. We just won't see the huge disparity of kind of an inherent value and market value that we're
Yeah.
seeing right now.
There's just, yeah, I feel the biggest thing that will change is the allure of a high grade modern card, because I understand the allure of a high grade vintage card because it's hard to find alternatives
Hmm.
yourself outside of opening the packs yourself. It's not the case for modern. You can always find these cards in very, very good condition, raw, and the slab is putting ridiculous premiums on. And
Hmm.
I think that will eventually change. I think this year will have been a lot of people's first experience with grading period. Either they've done it
Yeah.
themselves or they've started to get slabs in themselves, and they'll start to notice what is a PSA 10 card, what condition that is, how they can compare it to the cards that they pull immediately out of packs, what to start looking for, that sort of thing. So getting educated on grading is definitely something that will be happening over the next year to 2 years, I think, and it will change the way that we grade and the way that we value graded cards as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, excellently put, Joe. And honestly, you have been a wealth of information here today. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to have you on is you're really one of the few people that has such a good understanding, as I said before, of all three areas. And we've connected a lot of dots today that I think the audience is going to find very valuable and insightful. And again, as more of this information is put out there, I think it's just going to benefit the larger community. So I want to give you a big thank you from myself as well as the Nav Nation for coming on. And if for any reason people listening or watching, if they're not familiar with you, maybe they want to learn more about competitive play, where can they find you on your various channels?
Yeah, so the YouTube channel that myself and Jack run, a partnered channel basically, is the YouTube channel OmniPoke. Also, there is Team OmniPoke on Twitch if you want to see me literally playing the trading card game. That's oftentimes where you can find me. So yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Really have appreciated it. Really enjoyed stumbling upon your channel early on. I was actually one of the people, I put a comment on your video saying, there was one time where you didn't say double slap that like button and thunder punch the subscribe button. And I was like, man, you got to bring that back. So yeah, I've
Yeah.
really enjoyed seeing your channel grow, and I've also enjoyed the interviews that you've started to integrate in now and again. So yeah, I wish you all the good success in future.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, Joe, and we definitely would love to have you on in the future if you're willing to
Always
come
happy to.
back.
Always
You
happy
know,
to.
especially the competitive arena, it's always changing, and I think as more and more people become interested in this, to keep us kind of up to date with the current scene in the competitive arena, I think would be awesome. So you've got an invite back anytime.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
All right, excellent. Well, guys, that is going to do it for this episode of the Pokemon Masterclass. Be sure that you check out OmniPoke, aka Joe, and be sure to follow him on all of his different handles. I'll be sure to link that up down in the video description. And other than that, guys, we will see you all next time right here on the Pokemon Masterclass. Take care, everybody.